All right. Welcome, everybody. It is 2 p.m., so I'm going to go ahead and get started as people pop onto the line, and also for those of you who will be watching the recording, because we do record these, share them out after the call, and they are also all posted on our Nourish Colorado YouTube page. So I'm Chef Jessica, Jess Wright. Thank you all so much for joining our LoProCO call today, where we are going to be talking all about USDA grants that are not the Farm to School grant. And we're going to be sharing some fun culinary videos, as always. With this month, we are featuring tomatoes and chard. So as a whole, we're doing these monthly calls every month, obviously. And we're just using them as a way to continue the conversations around Farm to School, give you all resources, tips, tricks, connections, ideas, and then also give you ideas and recipes for products that are in season, growing in Colorado, and either available within the seasons or available year round. So we're excited to have you on the call today, as this topic is chock full of information, especially with our USDA grants. So we're going to try to be on time and rapid fire with our presentation. I have Chef Sarah joining me. She's one of our long-term chef consultants who has been with the LoProCO, Nourish Colorado, previously Live Well Colorado program since 2011, which is crazy how much time has flown by. And then I also have Dr. Becca Jablonski joining us. She is from CSU, and she is a professor on food systems and food, a food systems economist. So very excited to have her on the line. A little quick disclaimer, she does have her daughter is sick, so we might hear a little bit of background noise as she's trying to multitask, as we are all quite used to doing that these days and managing our little ones and virtual calls. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Chef Sarah, who's going to introduce the fruits and vegetables, technically a fruit, that we are featuring today. So I'll let Chef Sarah take it away.
Hi guys, can you hear me okay?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, so this is my first video that I'm doing on these webinars. So what I did is I just featured the chard and the tomatoes and made a few recipes with it, and you guys are going to watch the video in just a moment. But just some fun facts about chard. It is closely related to beets. However, beets are grown for their roots, and then chard is grown for their leaves. You don't want to eat the roots because they might make you feel a little sick. If you've ever had raw chard, you would notice that it has a bit of a bitterness to it, and that is due to the oxalic acid. In order to get rid of some of that bitterness, it's a good idea to cook it down some, even to use a little bit of water and rinse it off, like dump out that water. It is also, there's a bunch of different names for it, but we also call it Roman kale, silver beet, strawberry spinach. 1 cup of it contains 35 calories and provides more than 300% of the daily value for vitamin K. And if you look at the pictures on the bottom left, that's the rainbow chard on the left, and then the one next to it, you can see that the rainbow chard actually has rainbow colored roots, which is pretty cool. You might hear it just be called chard. Chard is just the blanket term for these, and you can buy it with the white stems and the green leaves, but when they're put together with the different colors, that's where the term rainbow chard comes from. And then for tomatoes, tomato is actually a fruit because it has seeds on the inside, but the government a while back, 1890s, decided that they wanted to make more money off of it, and so they started taxing it as a vegetable. There's other things like that as well, like bell peppers, which I'm going to be featuring in a couple months. It's considered a nightshade vegetable in the same category of potatoes, chili peppers, and eggplants. The second largest producer is with China, the US is the second largest producer. California is the top producer of canned tomatoes, and then China is the top producer of tomatoes. Florida grows the most of the tomatoes to use for fresh, And then some of the health benefits, there's a ton. Lowering the risk of cancer and cardiovascular disease. It treats inflammation, reduces hypertension, and the severity of different blood clots.
Nice. Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to share her culinary video as well. Let me make sure I get this all done correctly. And you all can see some more fun facts about our chard and tomatoes. So here we are.
Hello and welcome. This month we are going to be featuring some chard and some tomatoes. I'm going to show you a couple new recipes, and then I'm going to show you some tips and tricks for how these can be used, and also just a couple different ways to use these products. So let's get started. So first we're going to talk about chard. Chard originated in Italy, and it's very popular in the Mediterranean cuisines. It's not as well known in America, which is why I'm super excited to introduce you to different varieties and cooking techniques with chard. So we have 3 different major varieties of chard. As you can see here, we have a bunch of beautiful rainbow chard. It's called rainbow chard just because it has a bunch of different colors. So here you have one that's yellow, you have one that is orange. The ribs are really nicely colored as well. You've got some more of the red color, and then you have the white. This is known as the Swiss chard. So Swiss chard got its name from a botanist. It's not actually from Switzerland. This is the kind that you would find as Swiss chard if you were to go to the grocery store. There's also a red chard, which looks similar like this. It has the dark red stem, but there's more burgundy color in it. It might be a little bit more similar to a red kale. So how do we cook chard? There's 2 different ways that you can think about it. These leaves are really tender and the stems are much more hardy down in this area. Think of this more like spinach. It's going to wilt pretty easily and cook fast. The stems, however, you want to think of them more like asparagus. It's going to take a little bit longer to cook, and it's really good for braising down to soften them up. One thing that people hesitate about with cooking chard is that it has a bit of a bitterness to it. The bitterness can be removed by cooking, so sometimes using it in a salad might be a little overwhelming for some people. So if you're looking to start a garden, this is one really great crop to use, especially in Colorado. It has really, really good heat tolerance, so it can survive temperatures as low as 15 degrees, and it loves the sun, but prefers cooler temperatures. So you can plant it in the spring, or you can wait till the fall and get 2 harvests out of 1 seed. All right, so now we're going to talk about tomatoes. Tomatoes are very popular in the United States. Out of people that have home gardens, 93% of them grow tomatoes, and it is tomato season now. So I have a bunch of different varieties here, but we have about 10,000 varieties in the entire world. So I'm just going to talk about a few of them. The most common use of tomatoes for condiments used to be ketchup, but now in the last few years it has switched to salsa. So just to cover some of the many varieties that we can find here in Colorado, nowhere close to the 10,000. The most popular ones that we'll see at almost any grocery store is this one, tomato on the vine. We'll also see a lot of Roma tomatoes. These ones are good for pico and salsas and cooking over here. And then we have our beefsteak tomato. These ones are great for sandwiches. This is a green tomato, which is really good for cooking. This in a few weeks will turn red. Over here we have Campari tomatoes, which are more of an Italian style. These are kind of more of a kitschy tomato that's called Cumato. They call it kind of black, but even though it's green and it's pretty sweet. Over here you have another common grape tomato, which we'll be using in cooking today. These ones are super sweet. They're called pear tomatoes. They're my favorite at the moment. We also have our petite grape tomatoes. And then these are really, really fun one called sprinkles. I just found these. They're super fun to pop in the mouth. So the big question is, do I refrigerate this? And the answer is no. If you put this in the refrigerator, it's gonna lose a lot of its sweetness and also its flavor. So before you cut it, just leave it on the kitchen counter out of direct sunlight. You're gonna wanna store it as it ripens on different portions of it because you don't want it to bruise. But the reason we don't store it in direct sunlight is that it loses its quality of vitamin C. Also, something super interesting, and I don't even understand how it happens, but as this ripens, it actually gains weight. Do you know why?
All right, so that was our tomato and chard intro video for you all to see. I hope you enjoyed it. And I will say I have a bunch of chard and tomatoes actually growing in my garden right now. And I cannot wait for those tomatoes to ripen and that chard to actually get just a little bit bigger because right now it is still very much small. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Becca Jablonski to come on the line and start talking about grants and all of the different ones that are available to support your farm to school efforts. So
Well,
welcome.
Thanks so much, Chef Jess. It's super fun to be here today. We've actually been doing a lot of work on farm to school at CSU. And so I encourage you to go and check out our website. I'm not going to talk about it today. I'm really going to talk about grants, but there's lots of good information up there. And I would love to chat with you about it, about the research or about anything I'm going to talk about today. So don't hesitate to get in touch. Next slide, please.
Let's get cooking.
So the US Department of Agriculture has done a really nice job in putting together some information about grants and loans that support farm to school activities. Now, the caveat I want to give about these is that in my experience, most farm to school programs are actually funded through philanthropy. So they're funded through foundations. And I would say in some states, there's actually state level support that also exceeds federal support. But today we're just going to focus on these federal grants. And so I think what's really great about what they put together is that this very clearly and quickly communicates how you might find a grant dependent on the kind of entity you are. Now, my understanding is that everyone who's on this call today is likely from a school district, right, a K through 12. But if you are somebody who's outside of that, you could just kind of look at this quickly and see which of those grants you're eligible to apply for. Now, that being said, I think some of the most successful grant applications that I've seen to support schools, and I'll highlight some of those here in a minute, where the school district is actually not the PI or the primary applicant, but they're actually partnering with another entity on an application. So for example, you could easily partner with a Nourish Colorado. Nourish Colorado works on the grant, and then the school benefits from it, including could get funds as a subcontractor. And we'll talk about that more in a second here. Next slide, please. I also just wanted to highlight that if you're interested in local and regional food systems more broadly outside of farm to school, that there are other opportunities to look at grants. And so you can just check out here, this is another slide that USDA provides that actually looks at the programs, this time not through the entity that's eligible, but through the supply chain process, right? And so this is another way to think about what grant might be right for you. Next slide, please. So, and next slide. We don't have a chance to go through all of these grants today, but I wanted to highlight a few of them so you can see the red arrows point to the grants that we're going to discuss today. Again, I'm going to go over these very quickly, but it's really nice because what the USDA does is it makes sure that information about past grant recipients is publicly available. So you could actually go and look at the abstracts. You can do a search for your state, or in our case, Colorado. You could also do a search for farm to school, right? Because these aren't necessarily just farm to school grant programs. And so lots of publicly available information and ways to learn more. Next slide, please. So first I want to highlight the Local Food Promotion Program. And this is a grant that's administered by the US Department of Agriculture, USDA Ag Marketing Service. So I'm going to highlight these AMS grants first, Ag Marketing Service. These AMS grants in general are much easier to write than grants through some of the other entities like the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. AMS is really used to working with I would say nonprofits or, with schools and others. And so they figured out sort of how to make that process a little bit easier. The National Institute of Food and Agriculture, I think, primarily supports people like me, researchers from institutions of higher education. And so there's a little bit more of a heavy lift. Of course, we have support on the grant award side. And so that helps us and makes it a little easier on our end. But anyway, just to notice that the AMS grants are a little bit easier. The local food promotion program promotes intermediated supply chain activities. So what we talk about when we say intermediary is that this is a product that doesn't just move from farm to consumer. It moves through something in the middle. In this case, it could absolutely be a school, right? The other thing is that we know, and you all I'm sure are very well aware of this, that most farm to school products don't actually move directly from farm to school, right? And so you're working with a distributor. And so these can be really good grants that school districts can actually partner on. There's two types of these grants. There's planning, right, where you're actually planning what might make sense to do. And then there's implementation grants. The planning grants tend to be a little bit easier to get. The implementation grants, you really need to show you already have strong partnerships and a very strong sense of what you're going to do. But it's really nice this year. They actually increased the amount of award that was available per grant. And so you can see that these are pretty significantly sized grants. So in 2020, about 20% of applications were funded. And you might think that's not good. I think that's actually pretty good for these programs. And this year, I think we're going to actually see that potentially it's a little bit higher because there's some additional COVID funding. Note that these grants do require a match. Those matches can be a combination of in-kind support as well as cash match. Next slide, please. So there's the local food promotion program is a little bit similar to another ag marketing service grant, which is through the which is called the Farmers Market Promotion Program. So if you're interested in trying to figure out, which grant is really right for you to apply for, which really matches your needs, you can actually go to the web address that I provide here, both at the top and bottom. I've got it here twice, to really kind of use their decision tree to see what do you think is really the right program for you. Next slide, please. So this is an example. This is actually an organization that was the PI, the principal investigator, that I used to work with. I spent a number of years working in upstate New York. And so it's CADE, the Center for Agricultural Development and Entrepreneurship. What I wanted to highlight here is that this was a grant for $500,000 to increase institutional purchasing, but it's not actually the school district that's the primary awardee, right? And so what it did was it's this nonprofit organization that put together the right partners to actually try to promote farm to school. And I think there are lots of opportunities to engage in this type of funding opportunity in the state. So again, if you're interested in this kind of thing, please don't hesitate to reach out to me and we can help to think through who the partners might be. Next slide, please. Another application or grant program that I wanted to highlight, also through the Ag Marketing Service, is the Federal State Marketing Improvement Program. Now, when I've applied for this grant in the past, generally what I do is I talk to our Colorado Department of Agriculture. Our Colorado Department of Agriculture will often figure out who's interested in applying for this program from the state so that we can submit as a state what they believe is sort of the best or strongest applicant. And so we can talk about sort of how to do that. This grant does require a one-to-one match. But the purpose of this grant program is really to assist in exploring new market opportunities. And that can certainly be around farm to school or farm to institution, right? There's a lot of interest in those types of markets right now. You can see here that the max award is about $250,000. And so when I put the match as either 10 or 25%, that is for this specific year. So in the past, it's been this one-to-one. This year, because of the COVID funds, it's been different. And so I just wanted to highlight that we're not totally sure what that's going to look like in the future, and we'll have to see. In fiscal year 2020, you can see a quarter of applicants were funded. I think that's slightly misleading because of the process I mentioned where the Colorado Department of Agriculture sort of goes through this pre-process first. But again, I've had success in getting this. Generally speaking, they also want to see with these applications that there's support from industry. So for example, partnering with the Colorado Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, I think would make a really strong application. Next slide, please. And so here again, there's this really helpful decision tree that the Ag Marketing Service has about sort of what is the right applicant to apply, and some other questions. And so I just want to highlight this because I would hate for you to kind of get excited about a program and then figure out it's not exactly the right one for you. There's generally a lot of different programs available, as you could see from that slide at the beginning. And so thinking about what really is going to work rather than tailoring your idea to fit the program, that's never a good idea. Next slide, please. So here's an example of something that was funded, and this is actually out of New Mexico. You can see that they actually did not apply for the entire amount. And this is from a year, obviously prior to this one, when it required the one-to-one match, you can see. And so here what they're really trying to do is establish this New Mexico grown fruits and vegetable for senior meals and nutrition programs, right? And the idea is that this is going to meet multiple needs, right? Not only does this help seniors, right, providing fresh, healthy fruits and vegetables, but it also is going to create new market opportunities for New Mexico farmers. And so that's exactly the kind of thing you'd want to show in a FSMIP grant application. Next slide, please. One of the newest programs that's actually available through the Ag Marketing Services is called the Regional Food Partnerships Program. And so the goal of this program is actually to explore new market opportunities for U.S. food and ag products, as well as to encourage research and innovation. And so what they're really trying to do here is bring together diverse stakeholders across the food system to come together to do planning or making sure that the food system is working for all stakeholders. So this can include things like making sure that we're serving low income, low access households, which of course schools do in very important ways. In fact, I'm sure you've seen this, but we have data that about for low-income households with kids, about a third of their daily calories are through the National School Lunch Program, right? And so that helps to make a really strong argument. But here, what they want to see is not just that you're serving those students, but that you're actually bringing together maybe emerging distributors, right, that are trying to work with Colorado farms and ranches, and that you're actually then thinking about what are some of the needs for farmers and ranchers. Maybe there's a new processing capacity, or thinking about really how to connect those dots, and that's what this is about. Again, in this program, there's both planning and design as well as implementation. Just to let you know that in the first round of awards that were awarded last year, we received one of these in the state for Valley Food Partnership out in Western Colorado. I don't know if anyone's calling from out there, but you can see that right here. Thank you, Chef Jess. And actually go to the next slide if you don't mind. But what you can see here, how they've done a really great job, this is from their website, in bringing together these diverse stakeholders from across the Western Slope food system to really try to have better communication and think about how can they integrate some programming or initiatives or bring in investment that's actually going to support stakeholders across the food system. And again, here there are lots of opportunities. And in fact, I would say it's critical for both schools as well as other anchor institutions that can purchase larger quantities of products to be involved in these kinds of grant applications. Next slide, please. So this community food projects, this is actually administered by the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. And you're going to see, I'm going to actually highlight two different grants that are administered by the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. As I mentioned, these are a little bit harder applications because more of these programs are meant for researchers. This program is a little bit different from the others that I mentioned in that it really has to increase food security, right? So that is like a core component of this type of application. And I'm sure Chef Jess can talk about it. I believe Nourish Colorado has been awarded several of these, Chef Jess. And so anyway, that food security piece has to be a key part. But again, like the Regional Food Partnership, they're really trying to bring together the whole food system in meeting the needs of low income and low access households, right? Another thing to note about this, and I've been on the review panel for this one a few times, is that you can't really successfully propose projects here that are a one-off. You need to be able to show that through this type of USDA investment, that the program actually is going to, in the long run, be sustainable. And I really believe that that's a core component of this. And so it's something you want to think about, right? Where are there programs that you might be doing or that you might think about doing with partners, where if you got some of the seed funding to set it up, you could figure out how it might, there would be opportunities to cover the cost. Again, there's a planning as well as what they call the community food projects phase, which is really the implementation phase. Phase one here is smaller, $35,000, but really I think it's a pretty easy to get that piece. Even though I said 18% of applications were awarded, I don't have that information broken down by planning versus implementation. And my sense from being on the review panel is the planning is much easier. There's a much lower bar. 100% match is required. Next slide, please. And so here are two different examples, but there are a bunch of these grants that have explicitly involved schools. So the one on the left is talking about, it's called the Farm Fresh program, right? Again, you can see the highlighted here that it's meeting the food needs of low-income population by increasing their self-reliance, innovative marketing activities. And they have some interesting partnerships here, right? Including that they're going to be working to integrate Washington Farm Fresh ingredients. And then the other one here is with the Oakland City Schools. Oakland has actually done some really innovative things over the years. And what they're doing with their school district is to support the creation and operation of produce markets at 25 different schools, right? So hopefully you can see some things within these grant applications that are things that like maybe you've been thinking about yourself, or maybe with partners that you're actually interested in trying to implement should you be able to secure some of these dollars. Next slide, please. And here is another project that's focused on the Felder Academy, right? And this is actually much more about hands-on learning. Again, thinking about if this hands-on learning occurs, then you're going to actually increase literacy at schools around some of these farm financial pieces of information. And as a result of these kinds of things, the students, especially low income or low access students, become more reliant or more self-reliant, and that they're actually going to go then and work with communities in their region. So again, they're bringing together a lot of really cool things, but it has that food access, food security component. Next slide, please. So the final grant program that I wanted to talk about today that I thought might be of interest is this Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program. So the Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program is an application or grant program that we've been very successful with. Actually, it's CSU as the lead. There were 2 of these that have been awarded consecutively. And then I think there's going to be some others we'll hear about being announced very, very soon that hopefully will be coming to Colorado. So this is really to help beginning farmers and ranchers. Just so you know, beginning farmers and ranchers are defined by the USDA as those that have been in operation 10 years or less. And so that's really a pretty wide array of producers. Don't think that these producers are just small. Some of these can be multi-generation. It's the next generation that's coming into the operation. And so some of the farms and ranches that you might be working with might actually meet that definition, even though you've been working with them over time. Now, these awards are pretty broad, but they're up to $750,000, and they do require cost sharing or matching of 25%. And you can see that about a quarter of these applications were awarded in 2020. Again, I think we'll see more this year. And so there's quite a few opportunities to really leverage these kinds of opportunities. Next slide, please. And so one of the things that was actually funded through one of these grants was to actually create a program to support beginning farmers to facilitate farm to school market opportunities. And I could see a lot of opportunity in our state. You know, we have a pretty successful building farmer program is what we call it. And the building farmer program where we could develop courses that could be add-on courses specifically to work with school districts. And I think there would be a lot of interest in doing something like that. If you're interested in that, again, that's a great place to talk to me because we've been trying to develop some of these financial metrics specifically to support producers. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Chef Jess.
Nice. Thank you so much, Becca. That was amazing, and keeping your little one entertained as well. So one thing that I do want to note, and that you'll probably notice, is that a lot of these grants, the deadlines have already passed for them. However, now is the time to really get familiar with these different grants, start developing your process, your plan, identifying your resources, who could potentially be a lead or who could be a partner on these grant applications for you. Because when these grants are released, usually late December, early 2022, that timeline comes around fast. So it's good to really have your ducks in a row now or start getting those ducks in a row so that you're ready to go when these grants do become available again. Also to note that Becca did mention that we at Nourish have received some of the Community Food Project grants. These are for our Double Up Food Bucks program, which is helping SNAP recipients be able to double up their food bucks and basically purchase more fresh fruits and vegetables to supplement what they're already buying through their SNAP eligible purchases. And I also think it's really important to note that we hear quite frequently from so many people that we're just trying to figure it out. We don't even really know where to start. Like, who do I go to? Like, who are my farmers even in this region? How do I even begin? And this is where a lot of these planning grants are a great avenue to look at. In so many cases, when it comes to planning, we're doing this just on our own and adding it to our already pretty overloaded workload. So if you can actually get a grant to be able to support the funding for that planning component, that's huge. And it will also really help to build your plan, figure out what works, what doesn't work, and then you can move forward into that implementation phase. So I know I'm getting hungry, so I'm going to go ahead and share the next video from Chef Sarah with our chard and tomatoes.
Let's get cooking. Today for our first recipe, we are going to be making a blistered roasted grape tomatoes. You can also do this with different varieties of tomatoes. Like for instance, you can do it with your cherries, you can do it with your medleys. We're actually going to be using the medley for our next recipe, which is going to be braised kale with bacon and tomatoes. Roasting vegetables is one of the easiest ways to infuse flavor into our food. You can do it with many other products. And if you watched last month's video, you would have seen Chef Fernando doing it with radishes. But how we're gonna make this is we're gonna first wash our tomatoes, and then we're gonna toss it with some olive oil, and then do some salt and pepper. For this one, I'm gonna do a little bit more of an Italian theme with thyme. So use some powdered onion or some garlic if you're a garlic lover. I've got some oregano from my garden from last season, and we also have some basil. You can mix it up a little bit more by changing the theme and going with some chili powder or spicing it up with some chili flake. But today we're just going to be using this simple kind of Italian blend. First, you want to wash these, and then after you wash these, we're going to put these on the pan, and then we're going to toss it with all of these ingredients. After that, we'll pop it into the oven. It's going to be 425 if it's conventional, or 400 degrees at conventional. You want to cook them until they start to burst and get a little bit of char on them, so it might take about 10 to 15 minutes. So just check them halfway through, give them a little bit of a shake. Convection, 13 minutes. Looking awesome. All right, let's get cooking our second recipe. Now we are going to make our braised chard with bacon and tomato medley. To put this recipe together is going to be a simple saute. We'll first start with a hot pan and we'll add our oil. And then we will take our bacon and we're going to render it. So rendering bacon just means you're cooking down the fat, and then it's going to start to crisp up a little bit. After that happens, we are then going to add our onions, and we're just going to saute them till they're translucent. We're not trying to get any color on here, we're just sweating them out. Third step is to add our garlic, and then we're going to do our tomato medley. No need to cut any of this. And then our chard. So I'm going to show you how to do the chard cuts. That we're just going to mix together with some salt and pepper. The salt is going to help to cook down the chard a little bit more, help release its juices, and it's going to help to wilt this, and the wilting is going to cook off some of that bitterness. After that, we will just adjust seasoning to taste, and then we're going to add a little bit of lemon juice to balance it out a touch. If you don't have any fresh lemons, you can use bottled lemons, or you can even use vinegar. Red wine vinegar is my preferred one. And that's about it for this dish. All right, now I'm going to demonstrate how to cut this chard down. We're going to do something similar to a chiffonade. It's just going to be a little bit bigger. So when you do this type of cut, you want to put your larger leaf on the bottom here and just stack them up. You're then going to take these and you're going to roll them up. And I'm going to first, since these are so wide, you're first going to make a cut this direction and then you're just going to cut crosswise. When you get to the bottom of these, I'm going to separate these stems and use them separately for a different dish because these take longer to cook down. All right, so as you can see that I separated the stems here because they take longer to cook. I'm just gonna set them off to the side for now.
All right, so I'm going to pass it back over to Chef Sarah to share just a few more culinary tips and tricks for using these delicious charred and fresh tomatoes.
Sorry. Hi guys. So I just wanted to point out that recipe you can actually mix in with other items. So after we were done with that, I tossed it up with some linguine and we ate it for lunch. So it's really, really awesome that way. So just a couple other fun facts. You can saute these as seen. They can be baked into casserole. So you would just chop them up. You can mix it into rice or eggs, like a frittata. You can add them to smoothies. So instead of spinach or kale, you can pop some of those in. Raw in salads. Again, if you don't like the bitterness, I actually just had a kale salad for lunch, but you can add that a little bit in for color. And if you plant these into your garden, they can be added for color, but then also I would hope that you would eat them. And then just because they're so beautiful, you can put them in a vase on your table or on your island just to make it look a little nice. Then as far as the tomatoes have a plethora of uses. You can put them into sauces, so obviously like marinara or ketchup. You can make soups, both hot and cold. Obviously put them into salads. If you have larger tomatoes, you can stuff them. So just any sort of combination, grains and other vegetables. You can crush them up, use them for toppings of things, or put them into other sauces, or turn them into a condiment like ketchup or barbecue sauce. When you store them, you want to store them in a cool, well-ventilated area. As I mentioned in the video, you don't want to refrigerate them because it will reduce the flavor. They are very delicious when they're picked off the vine, warmed by the summer sun, as Jessica likes to say. But yeah, like when I have the smaller ones, I'll just pick them off and pop them. They often don't even end up in my kitchen. So there's just a few extra tidbits about these two products.
Thank you, Chef Sarah, for that. And again, I'm checking my tomatoes every single day, my little cherry tomatoes, just waiting for them to ripen so I can eat them right off the vine, because that is how I learned to love tomatoes, fresh tomatoes. I used to be only a cooked tomato person. And then I had my first experience with a sun-warmed tomato, and that changed my life. So hopefully you can have the same experience with your students as well if you happen to have a garden. I'm going to pass it back over to Becca so she can start sharing all of the good details about grant writing, which I will say we just actually wrapped up a local food promotion program grant. And some of these tips in here are very, very relevant, extremely important, because these grants, they can take your time and they can suck your life away for about a couple of weeks. So be prepared and definitely take some of these tips into consideration. All right, Becca, I'll put you back on.
Thanks, Chef Jess, and you can go to the next slide. But I will tell you that, as I was saying earlier, where you do not necessarily need to be the PI on these grants, one benefit of that is that it's generally less work if you're not the PI. And so it can be beneficial to your program or something you want to do. You can also receive funds from it without being the PI, so certainly something to consider. So when you're developing your idea, what you want to do is to draw on good or successful examples from across the US. So even though sometimes you're going to read language in the grant proposals or the RFAs that they want to see something that's innovative or something that hasn't, you're not sort of reinventing the wheel, it's okay to go and actually borrow ideas from other places. And so I've done that a number of times where there was something that I worked on, for example, when I spent my time in upstate New York, that I saw, hey, that really worked. And there's a reason why, if we did this tweak here in Colorado, that I thought it would work. And so I think actually that resonates with reviewers, right? They like to see that. And so I thought I'd just draw your attention to a website. This is through localfoodeconomics.com. And this is a project that my colleague Dawn Thilman and I have been part of with the US Department of Agriculture and 2 other universities. And we've been working with 17 communities of practice, including the National Farm to School Network, and to try to document some of the innovations that have happened during COVID. As well as what we're seeing in sort of trends in terms of how people are purchasing or acquiring food and lots of other things. And so I think there's some great ideas here, just as one example, that you could draw from in trying to think about designing a program or a project that might work for your school. Next slide, please. So timing matters. Chef Jess is exactly right that most of these deadlines have just passed that I highlighted. And that's okay, because these programs are set by the Farm Bill. So not to say that they don't change a little bit each year, but generally speaking, bigger changes happen in 5-year intervals, about every 5 years. So it's not based on who is the president, right? But it's based on who's in Congress when the Farm Bill is actually passed. And so generally speaking, you can expect that we're going to have very similar RFAs next year, with the caveat, as I was mentioning, that there were some changes this year specific to COVID. And so what you might actually do is not go to the 2021 RFA, but the 2020 RFA, for example, and see what it says. But I think either they're fairly close. And so you could start thinking through those now, right? Things like who's eligible are very unlikely to change. And so you can go through and really start to work with the people who you think should be your partners to see, hey, does this idea make sense? One of the first things that I'm doing when I'm starting a grant application is developing the budget, because I want to make sure that the scope of work that I think we need to do to be successful, we can do with the amount of money that the grant has available. If you are going to have to squeeze your budget or squeeze your partners, it's probably not worth it, right? There will be other kinds of opportunities. And so I really encourage you to really think about what you need to be successful. Or another way to think about it is, you could think about phase 1 and phase 2, right? You saw many of these applications have both planning and implementation. And so that's another way to sort of slice and dice it. Another thing to keep in mind that if you haven't written grants before, you may not be familiar with, is that the narrative itself may be only a very small portion of the work, right? So especially if you're a school that's going to be working with farmers and ranchers, you're going to be working with supply chain businesses, you might be working with Nourish Colorado, maybe with the Building Farmers Program. You might have to do a lot of subcontracts, right? Because you're splitting up the budget. You might need a lot of letters of support. And oftentimes, if I'm working with an organization, for example, like the Colorado Fruit and Vegetable Growers Association, it isn't as simple as just a call to their executive director. The executive director then needs to talk to her board about, is this something we want to do? And the board meetings happen on these regular intervals, which are less frequent during the summer. So anyway, these are just all the details that you actually have to consider and that are really important. It's not just the narrative. In fact, for me, the narrative is often something I do last, and it's because I know that I only have to rely on myself sometimes for the narrative, right? I get ideas from other people, but then it's about me writing it or me finishing it up. Whereas all of these other pieces require the support of lots of different community partners. And so that takes more time, and you can't just ask somebody last minute to do that. Next slide, please. So writing your proposal. A grant proposal is different than other kinds of writing. First is you really, really need to read the directions, right? So the community food partnerships is a good example. if you think, oh yeah, well, we're building community, right? We have lots of partners, but you aren't really explicit about the fact that you are serving food insecure communities and you are going to improve food security, you are not going to be awarded those funds. And so what you really want to do is see what's in that RFA, what's the language that they use, and how do you use that language, right, in your proposal. And what you want to do is set up your narrative that really very clearly addresses each section. The other thing about most of these USDA grants is they tell you exactly how they're going to score your narrative, or, you know, and so you can go through and say, okay, there's 20 points given for the project justification, right? And so you say project justification, and then you make sure to very clearly and concisely answer every single component of what they're asking you for in that RFA. So it's not about how well you write, it's about how clearly and effectively you can communicate answering the question and showing that you have a good project together. And I've included here the components of most proposals. So even as I said, if the RFA changes a little bit, if you're working off of that list, you're likely to have 90% of whatever they're asking for included. Next slide, please. So the executive summary or abstract, which is included in basically every grant I've ever written, is the last thing that I write, right? I make sure that I understand very clearly what we are going to do so that then at the end, I can go through and summarize it. You need to make sure that it's summarized for a lay audience, right? So don't think that the people who are reviewing your grant have the same kind of position that you do in a school, because you never know where these reviewers are coming from. And in fact, I've been on review panels where, for example, if you're a school and you're writing something that's focused on a farm to school program, this reviewer, all they cared about was the fact that you talked about food safety, right? Now, they can't only care about that in the sense that they need to award based on what the point structure is, but they felt like if that's not something that you understood in there, that you weren't necessarily going to be successful. And so think about this from people from all different kinds of discipline and life experience perspectives, right? You really want to think about making sure that this executive summary abstract is going to resonate with all different types of people. So have your neighbor read it, right? Someone who knows nothing about the kind of work that you do. The other thing I wanted to highlight here is that you really want to avoid these broad statements or descriptions, right? Like I've seen things where grant proposals start that say, you know, basically we're going to solve the world's food insecurity. Well, you're not. I'm sorry to say, I'm sure you have the best of intentions, but that is really not going to happen through this grant proposal. And so you really want to be clear about what can you do, right? You can improve food security outcomes for 15 students in your school, right? That's money well spent. Next slide, please. So when you're working on your statement of need, you need to make sure that you're clear on the current state of knowledge, right? And so again, it's really important to look at those abstracts. I told you the US Department of Agriculture makes those previously funded projects available. You can actually go and call those folks up. You could look on their project website, see what they're doing. And then you can say, you know, this is what they did. And here's the projects that have worked, parts that have worked and parts that haven't worked. You need to understand what has been tried in your region. And hopefully you know that well because you have the right partners at the table, right? Who can make sure you're aware of those things. You need to really be clear about why this work is necessary and why the funding is necessary. Again, generally speaking, you're filling a gap. The USDA funds are going to help you deal with the risk associated with starting something new or expanding something, but then it's going to be self-sustaining following this period, right? Because that risk has been mitigated by these funds. I think it's always helpful to play the so what game, right? Why do people care about this? And again, you want to make sure that not just people in your niche area care, but people that much more broadly care. Avoid jargon, hopefully that's obvious. And don't talk about these really big picture statements about the world ills, right? That doesn't help you. You want to be as clear and concise as possible. Next slide, please. So in terms of your description, you know, what I like to do, and one of the reasons that I work on the project description a little bit later in the process, is that I find through communicating with my project partners, I get a better and better sense of what we're going to do. And it helps me to be very then structured in my thinking so that I can communicate a very clear story. When I first approach project partners, what I do is I put together a one-pager that includes my goals, objectives, and activities. Now, these are going to change because I haven't necessarily had those broad conversations with all of the partners yet, but at least they have something that they can look at prior to when we actually have a conversation. And so, again, the goals are what is going to happen as a result of your project. The objectives are going to be specific and measurable, and they're going to show that because you've done these things, you're going to actually be able to achieve your goals. And then the activities, right, are going to be the components of the objective. And so I set these up at the beginning and make sure that all of my partners are on the same page, because then what I do is I actually can structure my narrative around these three components so that everything is clear and relates back to these three things. Next slide, please. So here's an example, and actually we have this worksheet available on our website, foodsystems.colostate.edu. I know we don't have a ton of time left here, so I'm not going to go through all of this, but we have these blank forms, and I encourage you to go and try to fill this out for a project that you are considering, because I think if you can fill out these boxes, and I would be happy to review them for you, once you fill out these boxes, it really gets you closer to developing that structured narrative. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the budget is really one of the first things that I work on because I want to make sure that I have enough money to do what I think we need to do to accomplish our goals. So you need to be realistic, but don't be bashful, right? Don't think that reviewers are going to look more positively on your application if you ask for less money. In fact, as a reviewer, if I see an application that I think hasn't asked for enough resources, that really makes me question if those individuals have the experience necessary to do this kind of work, right? And I'll give you a quick example. I recently, I'm actually almost completed now, a grant from the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. And with project partners, we said that we were actually only going to work with 2 communities. And this is a $500,000 grant. And so we thought, are they really going to give us a $500,000 grant to work with 2 communities? And in fact, when we got the reviews back, we had reviewers who said they understand what it takes to do in-depth work in these communities, and we applaud them for it. And so, really try to think about that. Don't shortchange yourself in that you need money to travel, right? In our state, it costs me, I'm in Fort Collins, it costs me $1,000 every time I go out to the Western Slope. You want to make sure that you provide stipends, right, for people who are advisors or mentors, or if you have producers, right, you want to compensate them for their time. You also want to think about where you might need consultants to help with things, right? That could be around translation, making sure that you have things in Spanish. It could be around signing. It could be around developing a database. Actually, Chef Jess and I are working right now with a partner to try to think about that. And all of these budgetary items need to be tied very directly to your activities, right? So that the reviewers can see that you are going to use this funding to do these activities, which is going to accomplish these objectives, which ultimately accomplishes your goal. Next slide. And again, on our website, that foodsystems.colostate.edu, we have a budget outline. And so I encourage you to go and take a look, right? And I hopefully, again, this helps you to develop your budget narrative and make sure that it's clearly aligned with those activities. Next slide, please. So for the rest of the application, you really want to think about who is the right organization, or which is the right organization to be the PI. So when I say right, there's going to be some organizations where they're not eligible for certain grants. That's kind of obvious. But also you want to think about what is the right sort of umbrella organization to manage the grant. So for example, if you applied for a building farmer and rancher grant this year and you got $750,000 to do that, these are all reimbursable programs. So the PI needs to be an organization that actually can dole out those funds, right? And then wait for reimbursement from the USDA, which often isn't quick. You want to make sure that the bios, right, of the people who are involved are going to lend credibility to the project. That doesn't mean you want just well-seasoned people. You want a combination of people in different experiences, but you want to make sure that you have the right people involved. The other thing is that for every person who's involved in the project, as an advisor, as a producer, right, in any way, I make sure I always get a letter of support, because sometimes there's applications that come in that don't have a letter of support, and you have no idea if that individual or that organization actually agreed to do what they said they're going to do. So it's really important to think about that. You saw that the grants that I mentioned required some kind of matching funds. Generally speaking, they don't allow for 100% of that match to be in kind. So you're going to have to be able to provide cash in different places. You know, I'm happy to talk through what that has looked like and what I've used in different times. You can often find it, but again, that means that you've done a lot more planning and prep work on the front end, because oftentimes that's much more difficult to get commitment for and then to document. And then finally, most of these grants require a management plan as well as a timeline. And you really want to work with project partners to think through that. What these funders ultimately want to see is that they are making a good investment with these dollars, because if they make a good investment and you're successful, it's going to help them get more dollars down the road to continue to fund these projects. And so you want to show them that they are going to give you this money, and therefore you are ready to run the moment you get this, right? And so you're basically giving them this application with these letters of support, the budget, the timeline, all of these things to say, fund me, I'm ready to go, right? And that's what you want to do. And so with that, next slide. You know, think like a reviewer, right? You really want to find and highlight a narrative that's going to directly connect to the RFP. If it doesn't, I'm sorry, I've used RFP and RFA interchangeably. One is request for proposals and the one is request for applications, and different funders use different terms. Apologize about that. You need to make sure that whatever you're proposing directly aligns with that call. If it doesn't, it's not the right grant for you, and there'll be other opportunities. Make sure the scope of work is linear, right? You want to show a very clear narrative. Even if there's additional complexity, sometimes you just don't need to include that in the narrative, right? You need to make sure it's a clear, linear story that is very easy to read, and most importantly, easy to rank, right, and judge, so that the reviewers can say, yep, they get full points for these different items. And the project summary, as I said, I always do that last, or and I make sure that that is the first thing, and it's really tight there, because that's the first thing people are going to see and how reviewers are going to start to see that. Next slide, please. So this is our website. If you scroll there to educational impacts, you'll find the section we have on grants, and we have a lot more information there, and I encourage you to take a look. Thanks so much for having me today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Becca. And again, a lot of the tips that she has reviewed have been so many lessons that I have learned over the last couple of years as we're applying for new grants, and I've been diving in more and more with that process. One thing that I have learned, especially for the budget, and as Becca says, like, do your budget first. Every single grant will give you the template for how they want their budget to look. And I highly, really recommend finding out what that format looks like and then building your budget to match that format. It will make your life so much easier. And then every single grant also has page limits as well. And they will let you know, as she said, like, they're very detailed, and they'll say, we only want 3 letters of support. So you can only provide 3 letters of support. So you need to be very strategic when you're thinking these through, who you're going to be reaching out to, who you're going to be bringing in, and also their own timelines, as she mentioned, for getting those letters of support. Some of our state agencies, it's a month. Like, you cannot expect to have that letter of support done in a week, even if you've drafted it up, because they have to follow all of their protocols and processes as well. So real quick, I'll show our closing video so you can see what all Chef Sarah was able to make and finish up. And then we'll have our closing and any additional questions.
And here we have it. These are the beautiful dishes that we created today. First, we saw the blistered grape tomatoes. These are good hot or at room temperature. I love having these with eggs or frittata. You can also toss them into a salad or add them in with rice. So many different uses for this simple recipe. Over here we have our braised chard with bacon and tomato medley. This is good just as is. You can serve it with different meats like chicken or beef. You can have it with rice. One of my favorites is to toss it in with some linguine with a little bit of pasta water, extra lemon, some red pepper flake, and have that for a light meal. All right, thank you so much. I had a lot of fun. I really hope you try these recipes, and happy cooking.
Just keeps repeating. Okay, so that is all that we have for you all. Our next call is coming up on August 3rd. This is all going to be marketing time, because it is prime time for back to school and to really market your farm to school program, no matter what role you're playing, whether or not you're a food service director, a local partner, or even a farmer. This is a great opportunity to spread the word about the good that you are doing. And we will be showing off sweet corn and Rocky Ford melon for that call. And then as Becca has mentioned, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to her, their website. I am always on that thing all the time looking for details. So I will be sharing links, this PowerPoint, because it is full of information, along with the recording and the recipes that we shared today for you all to try. Feel free to reach out to myself as well if you have any questions about the grants. It has been a deep dive learning process for myself too, as I start kind of peeking behind that curtain, not even peeking behind the curtain, actually being in the curtain and writing these grants and learning as well. So always happy to help and support. And thank you all so much for joining our call. I'll stay on for a few more minutes if there's any last minute questions, but otherwise you all are free to go and we appreciate you and enjoy your Tuesday. Thank you. And I'm going to stop recording. Thank you all.